Thank you all. I think we filled the couch. So the title of our session today is Sharing the Road. So really I'd like to ask you, Steve, Brandon, and Tom, can you share the road when basically all three of your companies are in this street fight for curb space? I mean, how do you, and then the average driver and the average pedestrian, how do you all coexist? Anyone?
I'll just jump right in. I mean, I don't know if actually I would consider it a street fight, at least between the folks on this panel. But I would throw out the fact that if you go to any street in America and you look at just like how the curbside is designed, 80 to 90% of that curb space is allocated to personal vehicles. And so I think that what you'll see, especially in like the coming years, is there has to be sort of like a reconsideration of how we allocate space and like what you want as a city, what is the sort of the goal and the agenda of that. Because the physical infrastructure that's there says that it's saying like, well, this is the market demand for like what it should be, right? Like it should be 90%.
That's the priority.
But the actual demand, or like what is increasing, right, is e-commerce, is the use of shared mobility or transportation network companies, is scooters or bikes or other modes of mobility. And I think that there has to be sort of that reckoning that takes place.
Yeah, and it's not a zero-sum game, right? We know the answer is not just everybody take rideshare. It's not just scooters. It's not just docked or dockless bikes. It's not just walking. It's not just metro. It's not just public transportation. It's a mixture of all of that. So it's going to require us to work together as private companies as well as with the public sector to find the most affordable and most equitable transportation options for everybody. Because the physical infrastructure of our cities isn't going to change overnight. In the meantime, we need to find and encourage ways of allowing people the best, most affordable transportation options possible.
But Brandon, are you guys working together?
We certainly talk quite a bit, especially us and Lyft, but and the other scooter companies.
Okay.
I think one of the things that's very exciting is that a year ago we weren't even having this conversation.
Okay.
Scooters were not even part of the conversation, and so now, and it's funny, when I walked in the door, I heard the mayor talking about it. I got a little nervous. What did I walk myself into? But I mean, that's the thing. Like cities have really been embracing this, and as we think about, what is talking about curb space, and I think the thing is like. There's very much by really developing our infrastructure appropriately, around the use of bike lanes, getting things off the sidewalks, that we can have a very strong infrastructure and we can all coexist very well. I mean, the conversation has shifted from like, oh, how are we going to prepare for autonomous vehicles? Now we're talking about, well, now we have scooters, now we have cars, trucks. How is it all going to work together? And I think now, to Tom's point as well, it requires us to all work together. But at the same time, it also, from an individual perspective, it's also getting stuff off of the sidewalks and making sure that we're able to kind of veer the roads in new ways.
Emiko, your organization, the National Complete Streets Coalition, you work to ensure safe, comfortable, and convenient access for all using our city streets. So how do you see this current battle for street and curb space?
Yeah, I think this is it's an exciting time because I think what these new mobility tools are doing is actually forcing us to look at our roads and our streets. And I would actually disagree a little saying it's a zero-sum game because in a way, I think there's room for a lot more modes. I think, though, it will come down to this is more modes, but I think this is forcing us to look at how we actually allocate space on our current system. Our infrastructure is reflective of really our values. And right now, as Tom said, we're still dedicating over 80% of our streets to mostly to parking. And this is starting to force the conversation about how we're actually not just allocating the curb space, but how we're allocating our roads, because I think there is room for scooters, there's room for TNCs, there's room for freight, but it's not putting them on the sidewalk or in the bike lanes. It's a conversation about, do we actually start looking at taking more of the right-of-way and accommodating other modes and looking at actually maybe we accommodate less space for single occupancy vehicles.
So trying to get people out of their cars.
Trying to get people out of their cars, but it's not even just out of their cars, it's that does the allocation of our space reflect our values and what we want for a mobility future? And
to be clear, it's not, like I said, it's not a zero-sum game. So there are no winners and losers. It's about finding the best possible solution.
Right, and I think it is a little zero-sum just in the sense that people do have to like there's going to be trade-offs. And that I think the users can win, but we do have to be honest about what this means for single occupancy vehicle use, whether it's autonomous or electrified or carbon run.
Well, and I like what you sort of brought up about values, because I have the luxury of like talking to a lot of city officials, and I'll ask them like, well, what are your sort of transportation priorities? And they'll say, well, it's safety, and then it's shared mobility or transit, and then it's goods movement and sort of economic development, and then it's moving people like in single occupancy person vehicles. I'm like, well, if you take that list of priorities and you take it to a street, it's the exact opposite, right? That like there's a bunch of parking, then you might be able to find a loading zone, you might have a bus lane, and you might get hit crossing the street. So like, I don't know how it's sort of a flip that has to happen.
Yeah, and this is where working with city planners and kind of redesigning our streetscapes are so vitally important.
But how do you do it in reverse? They're already there.
Well, one of the things I was going to mention is people don't walk out their front door and say, oh, there's cars everywhere, parked everywhere, but they'll say things about bikes or scooters, and so there's a shift that has to take place and a conversation that has to take place. To your point about even parking and how do we get some of those cars off the road so the streets go from just covered with cars to cars being gone, and really focusing on scooters or bikes or other pieces of transportation.
Tom, I want to go back to you. It's the busy holiday season, so I know you guys are, your drivers are everywhere, delivering gazillions of packages. But what are you doing differently, looking at these new challenges that you're facing? I understand in Seattle, downtown, you're trying tricycles?
We
Explain
are.
that, and we have a picture, I think, what they look like.
We are. You could.
A little
here.
different from the average bike.
So there's and this is actually a model that we have deployed in Hamburg, Germany. So
It didn't look
UPS's
like
volume around the holiday season essentially doubles. And e-commerce demand is obviously growing year over year at sort of an astronomical rate. It's like 15 to 16%. And so the demand for our services is growing, and then as sort of alluded to, right, there's less and less curbside space, and it's harder to get around cities, and it's more congested. So at least for this type of solution, which isn't, I wouldn't characterize it necessarily as like a holiday solution or something like that, but it's we have about 30 projects all around the world where we're testing and working with cities to try to explore, well, how can we mutually achieve goals in terms of UPS being able to serve its customers. Maybe in a European city, it's more air quality driven or sustainability driven. Maybe in the US, it's congestion driven or like road lane blockage, or you don't want to have a truck in a bike lane or something like that. So every city has different goals, and so it's on us to sort of how do you innovate and collaborate so that we can actually maybe even deliver as efficiently. It's not something that we can say like and put a stamp on and say, well, this bike is just as good as a truck, but it's something that we're testing and trying to learn from in collaboration with cities. Just to the point about what UPS is doing different this holiday season, actually a lot of I would say characterize the more impactful innovations that are happening in freight right now revolve around network planning and how to really optimize a network and to drive sort of like holistic efficiencies. I think what this sort of gets to is that like UPS runs a very integrated, consolidated network, and we're trying to move a great amount of stuff really, in a consolidated, efficient way, which is almost more like shared mobility in a way, right? You can imagine a future where e-commerce operates to actually reduce personal vehicle trips, right? So instead of Brandon and I going to Target individually, like Target is coming to us. But if there's also another future that e-commerce could just be like whatever you want, whenever you want it, however you want it, and then you just get a burrito delivered to you, and it's sort of like that burrito arrived in a vehicle. Like that didn't replace anything.
Right.
So I think that the more impactful technology then is like how do you actually drive that network scale and efficiency that you can run that really integrated, efficient network.
Brandon, one of your fellow panelists a minute ago mentioned safety, and it was back in March when thousands of these e-scooters started popping up on the streets of 100 U.S. cities, and we really saw a surge in injuries. We've actually had 2 people even die in scooter accidents. What are you doing to keep your passengers safe, pedestrians safe, and especially at this time of year when you have people on the sidewalks carrying packages, more distracted than ever, and then you start factoring in ice and snow?
Mm-hmm. So you know, I wouldn't characterize it as dropping scooters. You know, and especially I can't speak to how my competitors focus on, you know, going into a market, but we always, first, before I get to the safety point, we always look to strategically partner with cities in every step of the way. So before we actually go into a market, we're laying the groundwork, working with cities, working with stakeholders, whether it's in the mayor's office or DOT, talk about what we're doing, how we plan to engage from a safety perspective, but also when it comes to regulation. So that way there's actual, you know, those days of giving the middle finger to governments by startups is long over. And so really you need to work with them, showcasing how you can be a partner. You know, we very much look at cities as customers. We don't look at them as just like some, government, they're a nuisance. It's like, we got to work together if we're going to be successful. On the safety front, you know, what's really, so we're obsessed with safety, and we've kind of prided ourselves as being kind of an industry leader, you know, as far as the, you know, tools for our riders, not just we've given away 50,000 plus free helmets. Like, that's a great start, but that's not the solution to all safety, right? Which is why we really focused on honing in and talking with cities on the use of protected bike lanes. More money to infrastructure, to bike lanes is highly important. You know, where scooters go is where bikes should be going, in the bike lanes, on the road, side of the road, right? They shouldn't be riding on the sidewalk.
Or bikes go, scooters should be going, right?
Right. Scooters and bikes should be kind of living harmoniously, if you will. What's really interesting, though, on the safety point, and I know it gets a lot of clickbait, the data that we're seeing across the industry is showing that scooters are actually safer than bikes. Now, you don't really you hear more about scooters in the paper because, you know, it's the hot new thing. So if there are accidents, like, you're hearing about it more. Just like if, you know, when there was the first death on autonomous vehicles, like, you hear about it more. When was the last time you looked in the paper or online or whatever and you saw all these comments about bike injuries? Like, you probably can't remember the last time you did that, right? So the data is actually showing the opposite.
Interesting.
And so, you know, we're getting higher utilization rates than, you know, bike shares, sometimes upwards of 6, 7, 8 times greater. And so that's, you know, we very much think that this is revolutionizing micromobility, and safety becomes the #1 issue because one death is too many deaths. And, you know, another kind of key point is when you talk about deaths is it's the cars, it's the riders. It's not actually the people on the scooters that are at fault. It's the people riding the cars. You had a woman.
Are you saying distracted drivers?
I think in one case somebody ran a red light. You had a case in Cleveland where a woman was killed by a driver that was under the influence, right? So, like, those are the key things, not the act on the scooter, but what happened in that situation. And so we're actually seeing the complete opposite, which is scooters are very safe. Yes, there are accidents. It does happen. People hit potholes. They fly off. I mean, it's like anything else, any other mode of transportation, but it's what we do to ensure that we have the right policies in place in order to kind of grow the industry.
Steve, I know that Lyft recently acquired the New York-based company Motivate, and with that, you have become now America's largest bike share service, and you're also looking at scooters. So what's going on?
Yeah. So our mission at Lyft is to improve people's lives to the world's best transportation, and we feel that doing so is providing them multiple options for transportation, not just rideshare, dockless bikes, docked bikes, but also scooters. One thing we're also excited about is integration with transit. We are launching in several cities, currently Santa Monica, in DC in the very near future, integration with transit. So you open up your Lyft app, not only can you choose rideshare, not only can you today choose a scooter option, but you could also choose how to get to your location using transit. And that to me is showing sort of demonstrating how we're providing a full suite of options. What's fun about this for me from an operations perspective is when we talk to partners, whether it's universities, hospitals, government agencies, and they say, hey, what can you do for us to increase the parking issue we have, or the congestion issue that we have on our campus or in our cities? We can say, well, we have rideshare options, we have scooters, we have bikes. So providing a full suite of options and then tailoring those options to the city or to the customer, private sector or public sector, we think is sort of the best solution going forward. So we're extremely excited about it. I mean, this has all been recent news. I've been with Lyft for 3 years. I think every month, every quarter was more exciting than the last, and just in the last week, with the closing of the acquisition of Motivate and now launching of scooters, not just in the district, but also as of Monday in Arlington, has been really exciting.
Emiko, we sort of left something hanging in the air when you said other modes of transportation. What are you talking about? What's out there that we aren't using yet?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think, one of the things is if you were to think about, a year ago today, we didn't anticipate scooters. 5 years ago, who would have thought that we had the TNCs coming? We're not, and I think what we have to do is actually open ourselves up to there needs to be more modes. There needs to be, scooters are, feel how you do about scooters, but they only accommodate very mobile, active people. A lot of the work that we do has to do around people that are living with mobility challenges. I work pretty closely with AARP, who's looking to provide modes for people who are aging in place and might not feel comfortable riding a scooter. It goes back to, I think we can't, in a way, predict the modes that are coming. But that we have to prepare the infrastructure to support what's going to come regardless. We talked, and Brandon was talking about the safety issue, and what we do know, regardless of what the data is saying about scooters, is that our roads aren't getting safer for people outside cars. Last year, we killed about 6,000 people who are walking on our streets. We killed 6,000 people the year before, but it's only gone up every year, and that's while traffic fatalities have gone down. That's while walking rates are stagnant. So even though VMT's going up, so that means vehicle miles traveled is going up, walking rates are stagnant, yet we're killing more and more pedestrians, we're killing more cyclists because
now, is it a combination of distracted drivers and distracted walkers? You see so many people walking.
Yeah, no, I mean,
and their phones.
I would think in the same way Brandon said, it's not about, I think we focus a lot on what we call, and we talk a lot about this with the media, but victim blaming and really looking at we publish a report called Dangerous by Design, and this is, a research-based report that looks at how really America's infrastructure, because that's what we're talking about overall, doesn't support other modes. It was designed, the way that we design urban roads was we took the principles from highway design. So we get high speeds, high volumes. And what that does is it doesn't matter whether we're talking about scooters, whether we're talking about hoverboards, whether we're talking about like flying tricycle. Well, they would, but we don't know. But regardless, until we address the way that we plan, design, and fund our infrastructure, we're not setting up for this future. So I think that's the approach that I take. I assume that with innovation and the rate of change, we're going to have mobility options that make it possible. I mean, the boomers are a huge market. And someone out there right now is thinking about a way to get them around in a way that's new so they can age in place, they can access transit, they can provide, that they can have that. And we need to be ready, from a policy perspective to support that, or we're just putting them on dangerous roads.
Tom, before we go to questions, I wanted to ask you and kind of run across the panel too. What do you see as our way out of this as we do look down the road to the future? Autonomous vehicles, I know you're looking at that. Is that going to help?
So I think that there's like an element certainly of the technology innovation and like what will drive change overall, especially when you look to like congestion. I think that things like autonomous vehicles, drones, like they obviously get a ton of hype. But then sort of going back to my point about like network planning tools is like the thing I mentioned earlier. Like there are some like rather unsexy, like not super broadly like hip things that are actually very impactful, especially from a freight side. So you think about like containerization or universality of that containerization. So like, again, that ability to move things really efficiently between in a global supply chain from overseas through a port to a hub back to the city, like all of the, and then in an interconnected way. I think that type of innovation is actually what's going to enable in some ways the consolidation of freight or the just the expeditious movement of it into and out of cities. And then to what will actually solve it, I go back to sort of the like the technology itself, like if it's an autonomous vehicle or a drone or like whatever it is, isn't going to solve it without that partnership and collaboration with cities and that sort of philosophical change when it comes to how do you accommodate different modes, how do you redesign the curb, how do you have the policies underlying the whole sort of infrastructure, if you will, right? That like to actually change the behavior that you see on a daily basis and to sort of shift, I think the direction of things from like you're moving people, not just like vehicles around. And so I think that's the fundamental shift that has to happen.
Steve, just briefly before we do go to questions, what is Lyft thinking about as it looks to the future, especially right now as ride-sharing companies are actually increasing traffic in our nation's cities?
Debatable, right? So our goal has always been to improve people's lives with the world's best transportation. The only way to do that is to defeat traffic and congestion. I don't think that the rideshare companies are solely to blame for any congestion that people are experiencing. By a show of hands, how many people here drove their car to this event? So fewer than normal. You didn't prove my point. Fewer than normal. In most rooms, when I ask that question, the large majority of people raise their hands. I used to work at 17th and Pennsylvania next to the White House, and I was subsidized by my employer $300 a month to park my car. That doesn't help the situation. It incentivizes me to take my car. I think we have to figure out, not just look at the rideshare companies and congestion, but also talk to private companies. This is an enterprise play as well. If we can convince enterprise companies to get on board this, I think we could really help defeat the problem in a larger, massive way.
Well, let's go to questions, and we have one right here. If you would identify yourself, please.
Hi, Hamza Sani. Actually, the reason I drove, it would be part of the question, because I had to drop off my wife and my son this morning. So my question is about, I think a lot of technology innovations around rideshare has been focused on individual movement, individual person. How about family innovations? What's on par in regards to addressing that?
Great question.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump on it. Sure, I think the families, so besides providing transportation as a service, the idea of shared rides is a big thing. So my wife and I, when we commute on the same day together, we often share a ride together. We could share a ride together, and we're filling up more of those seats. One of the problems is that we face is providing transportation options in ride shares for minors, and that's something that we're currently talking about, but I don't think the industry has come up with a really good solution for that. But I probably get that question more than any other question on panels like this, is how do we get our kids around, because that's a big problem. The family situation, I think, is something that needs to be looked at next, because you're right, we look at individual mobility options. A lot of our transportation solutions are focused on urban centers, and in urban centers like DC, where 38% of all households don't own and operate their own car anyway, we're seeing people choose individual transportation options, and it's working. I think once we see more rideshare usage and those vehicle miles driven are extending into the suburbs, we're going to have to focus more on that issue.
Okay. Question back here. Gentleman who hasn't asked one. There we go.
Hi, Jan Mears is my name. As a person who walks in this city 5 miles a day and almost every day is almost hit by a bike on the sidewalks, almost hit by a biker or a scooter, why are you not trying to prevent them from being on the sidewalks?
Brandon?
Well, first of all, I got to give you props for walking 5 miles a day. That's
Excellent.
amazing. But to your point, actually, we have been pushing to get scooters off the sidewalk for almost since inception. We actually are trying to declutter sidewalks. As I kind of pointed out, we educate riders from the beginning not to ride on sidewalks. And in vast majority of cities, you're not supposed to do it. So they shouldn't be doing it anyway. So if we hear that there are problems, whether it's from concerned citizens, policymakers, whomever, we seek to directly address it through our community managers do it. We do stuff within our app. We educate on social media. We hold events. So we look to actually try to get people off the sidewalks into the bike lanes or riding on the side of the road, as I'd mentioned, where bicycles are going, which they shouldn't be riding on the sidewalks either. But that's our perspective. So we always constantly look to iterate and educate people not to do that.
Emiko, last
Well,
word?
yes, thank you for letting me have the last word. I think that's great, and I think that brings up the challenge that really we had talked about this backstage. But what's one thing that cities should be doing, our locals, is that we need to again, and I'm going to harken back to the same talking point is that we have to proactively plan for a new mobility future. And the reason that those scooters are there is because they don't feel safe somewhere else. If you've been, I mean, how many people have been on a scooter? Right. And how many people feel comfortable riding in traffic on a scooter?
I'm used
Right,
to
and so, and I'm a cyclist, and in my route, I live in the district from my house to DC. I'm not always in a protected bike lane. And so if we're really talking about a new mobility future, how do we actually provide that space? Because those, I guarantee those scooters aren't on the sidewalk because they just feel like they need to be on the sidewalk. They're there because it's the safest place for them to be, and that we need to, again, look at the space that we allocate.
If I could, we talk about allocation and incentives. Oftentimes, communication, community affairs managers. There's also an enforcement side of this as well. So I sit on the DC Police Foundation, and I actually have a meeting this week with the Assistant Chief of Traffic who deals specifically with this, and we're going to be talking about enforcement. So hopefully that helps solve some of your problem.
All right.
Although I do think that comes with a little loaded, because we have to, one of the big issues I think in biking and enforcement and in cars and enforcement is that, I'm going to take it to a totally different perspective, but we have issues with enforcement in this country.
Yeah, definitely.
And when we look at who's adopting scooters, and we look at the fact that we're much more likely to criminalize people of color, and honestly, my neighborhood, the people who are adopting scooters are young black men, and I bet they're the first ones that are going to be profiled to take over. So I think, and again, the best way is through the infrastructure, and then enforcement comes with its own issues, I think. So,
Yeah.
so I caution those who look at enforcement as a solution.
Well, we could go on and on, but we are out of time. Thank you, audience, and thank you, Steve and Tom and Emiko and Brandon.